Thank you all for being here today. I'm extremely grateful. I want to thank Gayle Lemmon, how do you say it again? Lemmon, for writing her incredibly powerful book. Ashley White and her cultural support team colleagues have been unsung heroes, and they deserve their stories to be told. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and I know we're all going to learn a lot about how much we have to gain from allowing women to serve with our special operators. Very briefly, there are 3 points I want to highlight here that I learned from reading Ashley's War, and then we can get to the discussion. First, I found it striking that the cultural support teams, the all-female special operations enablers, they came about because of Admiral Olson and other high-ranking special operations commanders realized that they needed to have women on the battlefield. These commanders realized that it didn't matter how skilled their elite male troops were. Without women, they were only accessing half of the population. They were only questioning half of the population. They were only searching half of the population. They were only building trust with a very small part of the population. Ultimately, it was these commanders who realized that the United States was not going to succeed without including women in the fight. And they were able to model their plan off of the Army Lioness teams in Iraq and the Marine Corps female engagement teams in Afghanistan. The second point I want to make that I found to be striking was the transition that so many trainers, supervisors, and commanders made after these women joined. Many of them started off as skeptics who were unsure what advantages could come from having women supporting our special operators in very difficult combat environments. But something happened, and they realized that actually these women are loyal, committed, and highly beneficial to America's war efforts. What made the difference? The change in opinion happened when these trainers and commanders actually observed these women in training and on the battlefield. The special operators came to rely on these women as much as they rely on the men, and they realized that without the women, their efforts in Afghanistan were simply incomplete. The final point I want to make before we begin our discussion is about the transition our military is currently making to opening up combat positions to women. I support having women serve in combat roles in our military because I want our military to be ready for any challenge it faces. I want our military to be populated by whoever is best for any given job, regardless of gender. The armed services each have until January 2016 to either open up all positions or request exceptions. I want to make it clear today that nobody thinks that our standards should be lowered so that women can join. But I do believe that the only reason our armed services should even consider exceptions is if they think that no woman could ever meet a gender-neutral standard that they are developing, and that none should ever be given the chance to try. Based on Gayle's book, I think this is highly unlikely. In the meantime, I look forward to hearing today about the lessons of Ashley's War and how the women of combat support teams changed the way we think about women on the battlefield. And with that, I'll turn it over to the panel. Or maybe Dick.
Thanks. I'm the only thing standing between you and the panel, so I'm going to be very brief. But I really want to thank, first of all, Captains Amos and Miller for your service, for your extraordinary contribution to our nation, and to Gayle Lemmon for a really powerful book. And I hope that more people read it before the movie comes out. I understand there is going to be a movie. And to Martha Raddatz for her continuing work, not only as a reporter, but as a champion of our national security, of telling the story of our military through their eyes, through the eyes of ordinary men and women, and through their parents. And Captain Olson, who has led the nation in special operations, which is really, as you all know, the warfare of the future. We're going to be doing more and more special operations, less massive invasions with troops on the ground or boots on the ground in combat roles, as you know. I come at this issue through various perspectives. One is as a member of the Armed Services Committee and the ranking member on the Veterans Affairs Committee. So that's an official role. The other is as a veteran. I served in the Marine Corps Reserve, but much more importantly, as a dad, 2 sons who have served in the military. And we have come a long way as a nation in making use of the enormous resource that women can provide to our national defense in all kinds of roles. But we still have a long way to go. And that's why this story is so important and so powerful, because, as Senator Gillibrand has said so eloquently, a military that fails to use the tremendous gifts, talents, and insights that women can bring on the battlefield is missing a major part of its resources. We all, I think, in the Senate remember sort of extraordinary moments in our service here. And one of them for me was to talk to Admiral McCraven, a very small group at dinner, about women in special operations. At that time, I had no idea that women served in special operations. And he described to me what it meant for a woman to be part of, it's called a cultural support group, but basically to serve alongside, as partners of a team, talking to women whose homes they were entering. Women who have been taught through their whole lives, do not talk to men who come into your home whom you don't know, and some of the men you do know. And for them to be part of this team opened a whole new source of intelligence, of protection, and of strength. Strength, stamina, courage, that's really part of this story, and such an important part. But the other part of this story, which we haven't yet really addressed, is what happens to women as well as men when they leave the military. Women veterans, an increasing part of our population, an increasing part of the veterans population, and unfortunately and tragically, a part of the population with whom we fail to keep faith. As the ranking member on the Veterans Affairs Committee, I have pushed very hard for a recognition, not only of the service of women while they're in the military, but of what we owe them afterward, and how we need to recognize that they suffer the same wounds, invisible wounds, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, as our men, and all of the other wounds that come back from the battlefield with them. This nation is failing to acknowledge and to address that need. Just last week, our committee had a hearing on women veterans and how in hospitals, clinics for female care are in the basement, small rooms, inadequately staffed and equipped. You may think that's hyperbole, but in fact, that's the case, or has been, at the West Haven Hospital in Connecticut. Simply a symptom and a symbol of our failure to address the needs of women veterans. So I am really proud and excited that we have this really wonderful set of stars here. I'm very grateful to be a small little part of it, and especially thankful that this book and this effort will help to raise awareness, not only within the military, but among the American people in general, of the enormous contribution that our women can make to our national defense. Thank you very much. And now we have the panel.
Than that. This book is extraordinary and really does open up a window into something that most of us never see. She is now a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2004, oh, that's what I have to do. Do I need to repeat myself? You'd think I'd know that in TV, right? In 2004, she left ABC News to earn her MBA at Harvard. At Harvard, she focused on women entrepreneurs in conflict. Her previous book, The Dressmaker of Karkhana, was an international bestseller and focused on women entrepreneurs in Afghanistan, where Gayle and I shared a meal one evening. We were just, I couldn't even tell you what year that was. It was a long time, and she's been going back ever since, and I have as well. She is a writer of many articles, Christian Science Monitor, Herald Tribune, The Daily Beast, the World Bank, Harvard Business School. She was, I love this, also a Fulbright scholar. Her book, Ashley's War, was released this April, and it has been picked up by Fox 2000 and Reese Witherspoon for a movie deal. Admiral Eric Olson, he told me this is the second time I think he's spoken in public or done any sort of moderated panel. The second time, the first time, was also with me, so out at the Aspen Institute. He has an amazing career. He retired from the Navy after 38 years. His last assignment, commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command. That was from 2007 to 2011. And if you remember, 2011, there was a very well-known special operations mission in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And don't even bother going there with him because he won't say a word, and he didn't put that on his bio. Admiral Olson was the first Navy SEAL appointed to the 3- and 4-star flag ranks. He's described by many, and I would say including me, as one of this century's great military leaders because of the military operations he's led, and also for things like we are talking about today, his role as a key architect of the cultural support teams and their implementation as discussed in this book. And Admiral Olson reminds me that he actually wasn't there when it was finally implemented. And I'm very, very proud, as we all are, to have Captain Emily Miller and Captain Tiffany Amos. Captain Miller is a second-year student at the Harvard Business School, following Gayle's footsteps there. Following her graduation from West Point in 2008, Emily commissioned as an engineer officer in the U.S. Army. She led an engineer platoon in reconstruction efforts in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom in Basra. Later, she was selected to serve as a cultural support team member embedded with the 75th Ranger Regiment on combat missions in Afghanistan. Emily completed 2 deployments to Afghanistan as a CST and earned a Bronze Star and also a Combat Action Badge. She trained and deployed with First Lieutenant Ashley White Stumpf, who this book is about. Captain Tiffany Amos began her Army career by enlisting at 18 years of age. In 2007, Tiffany received her bachelor's degree in philosophy and Farsi from Millersville University in Millersville, Pennsylvania. She deployed with CST-2 in August 2011 to support Special Operations Forces conducting direct action raids. And that's where I want to start with you, Gayle. This is different. I have covered the integration of women, by the way, in combat for many, many decades. It is done very differently now, and not just in the air, in combat, but on the ground. And over my years of covering Iraq and Afghanistan, I have seen a lot of women who've been involved in battle who everyone said, wait a minute, had the same reaction, what were they doing there? But this is different. Talk about the core of this book, what it is, who Ashley was.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be on this panel. Martha Raddatz, for when I was first starting out, was one of the reporters you always not only was a role model, but was a mentor and was one of those people who actually gave you advice and would sit with you and talk with you about what your options are. And as any of you in Washington know, that's very rare to have somebody who would actually take the time and be as incredibly thoughtful as she is. And Admiral Olson is among the most powerful interviews I've ever done in my life, which is I've done many, in that is among the most thoughtful people I've ever had the privilege of spending time talking with, and who really helped me to understand what the thinking was that went into this very groundbreaking program with a very benign name. And then I want to see, both Captain Miller and Captain Amos, when you spend time around people who are motivated by purpose, I think it does change you, and it also makes you work even harder. The responsibility and the privilege of telling this story, Ashley's War, is something I go to sleep with and I wake up with, and it is something that I take very seriously because I knew, just a few months into the reporting that this was something very special that mattered to the country because it's a team story of service and sacrifice and heroism and courage and of the power of serving something greater than yourself. And it just happened that we hadn't seen a whole team of women. But what motivated them, as Admiral Olson said in our first interview, was largely what motivates men, right? The desire to be part of something that matters, the desire to serve on a mission that is important, and the desire to serve with the best of the best. So this story is really about the security gap that Admiral Olson, Admiral McCraven, General McChrystal had seen early on, which was that, as Martha said, you were missing half the story, and they were talking about this, Senator Gillibrand and Blumenthal alluded to it, that there was a piece of the puzzle that was missing if you did not have women. So it was not a social mission, it was a security need that sent women onto the battlefield. And when I first found out they were there, I set out to answer 3 questions. Who were these people? What were they doing there, and why don't we as a country know about them and their service? So it's been a huge privilege to bring, I think, this hero story that looks a little bit different from some other hero stories, but at the core of it is just exactly created and formed of the same stuff, which is courage, heart, valor, and grit. And why you would raise your hand not once, but twice. So not once to serve in the National Guard or in the active duty Army or Reserve, but twice to be part of a special operations pilot program to put women on the battlefield alongside special operations to fill a very specific security gap and to see the kind of combat seen by fewer than 5% of the entire military within several months of being chosen. So thank you.
Gayle, would you tell us just briefly about Ashley?
First Lieutenant Ashley White Stumpf, I think, is, as everyone told me in the first 9 months of interviews, was the best of us. She was someone who did not ever talk about how good she was, but would simply show you, and in fact, was kind of mortified about showing you. There are stories about her during Ranger pre-mission training where they said, climb rope. And here we're going to show you how to do it using your hands and feet. And Ashley sort of shuffles up and does it 3 times using only her arms, and then gets down and apologizes for not doing the way that it was instructed. Because they said, use both your arms. You're like, she was the kind of person who loved to make dinner for her husband and loved to put 40 pounds on her back and go march for 11 miles, who could go to the gym and do 25 or 30 pull-ups from a dead hang, who would work out 3 times a day, who would push herself to the ultimate limit, but who, as one of her Ranger trainers called her, was the Megatron quiet blonde who looked like a Disneyland greeter. She was this mix of very fierce and very fit and very feminine. And really, I think, was one of the people who would have been the last to accept that we are talking about her today. But I think her service, her sacrifice, and her moral core is a reminder of the best of American character at a time when, quite honestly, I think we could use a reminder of it.
Thanks. Admiral Olson, when you thought of this, and we've obviously heard a little bit about why you thought it was important to get women on the battlefield with Special Operations Forces. Just talk us through your thought process, and we've all talked a little bit about the name Cultural Support Troops. The name is really benign, and there was a reason for that, right?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I have to admit I was a little bit of a reluctant acceptee of the invitation, but I did feel that it's an important enough topic that I wanted to have the opportunity to join this panel and be part of it. And I thank you, senators, for doing this. It was really pretty straightforward. My mission as the commander of Special Operations Command was to provide options to optimize the capabilities of the small tactical teams that we were deploying forward. I didn't have command of those teams once they left the United States, but it was my mission to make them as capable as they could be in preparing them for deployment. And we did this by providing for the teams a number of so-called enablers. And they were attached to the teams and not assigned to the teams, and there's actually a legal distinction in the term. But they included linguists and interpreters and civil affairs teams and military information support teams, previously called psychological operations, dogs and their handlers, unmanned aerial vehicles at the very small level, at the small tactical level, intelligence analysts, mechanics and cooks and the like, so that the teams themselves could focus on what their mission was and be supported by specialists who could do a number of other things that were essential in the remote environments in which we sent them. And we were deploying teams to do primarily two things. I mean, there were a lot of things, but two big bins. And one of them was village support operations. These were sending small teams far forward to stay for a long time, to get to know the villages, get to know the villagers, and partner with them, train with them in order to provide an element of security in that place. And the second bin was the direct action combat raids and assaults to capture or kill terrorists and people who had earned their way onto a specific targeting list. And to these teams, we also provided explosive ordnance disposal technicians, technical and document exploiters. They collected biometric data. They collected cell phones and computers. We provided second-level medical care to them. But it was during a visit to one of our village support operations teams that I was struck by a member of the military information support operations element there who was female. And she had been there for 3 rotations of Army Green Beret teams. She'd been there when one arrived. She had been there for 6 months while another went through its whole deployment, and here she was as that one was being relieved by yet a 3rd team. She was the subject matter expert in that place. She knew the village better than anybody, and we talked about the value that she felt that she added to the team. And I have to say that was a germ that a seed that grew into the cultural support teams. We had female operators in the special operations community long before we had cultural support teams. They've been there for decades, mostly in civil affairs and in the military information support operations elements, and they've done fabulous work for a long time. What we didn't have was a structured program to recruit them, train them, equip them specifically to do what it was women can do better than men in the villages where we were sending these teams. It was far more random than that. So the idea to create the cultural support teams was born, and I mean, people want to talk about sort of the resistance that there was to it, but institutionally there wasn't that much. I mean, I had the authority to make it happen, and so we just did. It was within our budget at Special Operations Community. It was within our people at the Special Operations Community. All we needed was for the rest of the Army to provide the opportunity for women to volunteer to do this kind of work. And some commanders were reluctant to let their best women leave the units, and some encouraged their best women to leave and take advantage of this new assignment that was available to them. So Martha asked about, and by the way, Martha, you're right. This I'm batting 1,000, two out of two with you as the moderator.
And I actually think at the time, and this was 2011, at the time in 2011 when I interviewed before, I said, "Is it time for women to be in special operations teams?"
You did, yeah.
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
And
it
you
was
said,
an
"I think
hour
you-"
into our
Yeah, here we
Aspen
go.
talk. And so cultural support teams was picked as sort of the least bad term we could come up with. We didn't want the word female in it because that painted or tainted or targeted the team in some way that we thought wouldn't be helpful. So we didn't want female. Cultural was actually the impetus for the team. We were operating in a different cultural environment than we had ever operated in before, and that cultural environment required us to engage with all people in a way that the men couldn't. And so it was a response to the cultural environment. Support because the direct combat exclusion rule was in place at the time, and these teams had to be supporting elements. And then the word team was very important. Although they ended up often operating as singletons, they were initially envisioned to operate as small teams. And they did train and deploy as small teams. It's just that there's not always room on the helicopter or in the vehicle for the whole team, and so they were broken up into individuals to do the jobs that they did.
Did anything about that name, cultural support teams, have to do with helping them assimilate with the Special Operations Forces?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. It wasn't designed with that intent, but the Special Operations community is used to all sorts of support teams. The enablers make the operations capable, and the cultural support teams fell into that category of operational enablers.
Okay, I want to turn to our captains here. Emily and Tiffany. Emily, why don't you start and talk about your time training, whether the training was good enough. I mean, not only physically, but I keep going back to this, the way they used to do it and the way they tried to assimilate. And if you look back to the Navy trying to bring in aviators or the Air Force trying to bring in aviators, they were out there as kind of trophy girls. And it didn't work so well at first. All that attention on them. It's very different now. I think those are real lessons learned from before. So talk about, each of you, your experiences. And certainly Ashley.
Yeah, I think I thought the train-up was done extremely well. I think all of us would probably say we would have loved to have had more time training. But we went through an initial assessment and selection, which was 10 days long, where there was about a 50% attrition rate. And then we moved into summer training, which lasted about 2.5 months. And then we had the opportunity to do pre-mission training with trainers from the 75th Ranger Regiment for a few weeks before we deployed. Of course, I wish we could have had longer, right? These guys train for years and years. They go on countless deployments. Some of these guys have deployed 12 times. So coming into the program, having never gone to Afghanistan, having never done anything with the special operations community, I was nervous. And I didn't feel like, 3-4 months of training was enough, for sure. But the trainers that we had were excellent and were very supportive. And I think they put us through plenty of physical rigor, physical tests. So I felt like by the time we got there, we were set up for success.
And I would add to that, the 1 week that we spent with Ranger Regiment, it's called pre-mission training, was far and away the best training that we received when we were actually assimilated with the customer, the end user, the people that we would be integrating with. The quality of the training skyrocketed, and I think that was one of our biggest feedback was, hey, more training with the soldiers that we're supporting with Ranger Regiment.
Can you both talk about what it was like out there? Talk about what it was like out there, what you did on a day-to-day basis, how much help you think you really, I mean, we'll let everybody read the book and some of the extraordinary examples that Gayle has about really things that made a difference in that fight, really made a difference in the fight, and the kind of intel you'd gather. But just give us a sense of what you do on a day-to-day or a night-to-night basis would be more accurate.
I'll set the scene. We were out there every night assisting and enabling the special operations community in conducting night raids. Middle of the night, 50 pounds of gear on your back, up and down Afghan mountains, very high elevation, and that's where the physical fitness really came into play. If you slowed down your platoon, if you couldn't keep up, if you fell out on infill or movement to target, you were a liability. You were jeopardizing the mission, and you were jeopardizing the lives of the soldiers on the ground. In my opinion, we were able to do a lot of good because there were many times that the women on target presented a threat to the men. Women are just as capable of hiding an AK-47 or an S-vest under their burqa as a man is. Not under his burqa, probably, but... And we were able to tactically question and provide a lot of intel that was otherwise inaccessible.
Yeah, I would just say, a daily, day in the life picture was a lot of physical training. If we weren't on mission, we were training with the guys. They were very adamant about, if we weren't actually out on mission that night, that we would be doing something else. They would be acclimating us, with the canine handler, or we would be doing medical training, or we would be doing fast rope training. And when we were out on mission, yeah, I guess I saw a big shift in all the teams I worked with. I had worked with a few teams that kind of had come in and out because they did much shorter deployments than we did because they're so high intensity. And I saw a huge shift in their attitude towards us over the span of that. I think one, they saw us coming in as a liability. They saw us as, oh no, we have a female with us. Is she going to be able to keep up? Is she going to get hurt? They weren't sure what to expect. But as time went on, at least the teams I worked with loved us because we got so much intelligence and so much information for them, and we could find the terrorists that we were going after much quicker. We were much more accurate usually because the women and children knew what was going on in the community. They knew everything that we needed to know, and they had been ignored for so long. So I think very quickly their mindset towards us shifted to being an asset and not a liability, and that was very great.
I can tell you want to jump in there, Gayle. Taking notes.
To highly trained to take notes, yes. Yeah, I think that it really matched what you saw over the course of 2 years of interviews for this book, which was that one of the Ranger trainers said to me, first they said, "Oh, you got to go train girls," and I was like, great. And then he said, well, what am I supposed to teach him? And he said, teach him what you teach anybody. And so by the end of his time training them, and there are lots of colorful language in that chapter, but there's a whole chapter sort of about his evolution as somebody who had done 12 combat deployments as a Ranger, so certainly knew combat, from being not fully skeptical, but kind of eyebrows raised to being one of the strongest backers of these women and their capability that they brought to the battlefield. And, he even told me, he said, by the end, I really felt like one day this may be our own Tuskegee Airmen, right? That these were people who were going to lay groundwork for whatever came next. And in fact, in June 2013, Major General Sokolow from Special Operations Command then cited these teams, cited Ashley and Captain Amos, Captain Miller, all of these teams, 1 to 8, saying that the gals of I think he said the young girls of the CST have proven themselves to be a tremendous asset, and they may well have laid the foundation for ultimate integration. So I think that there were people who were very much paying attention to what they did, but that the battle was every night to be accepted, and that so many of these guys had done 10, 11, 12, 13 deployments, that all they were looking for was people who could help them accomplish the mission and get them back home safely after having done the work that they set out to do that night.
And Olson, talk about where it goes from here. There was talk that the program should end. What happens next? When we're not in Afghanistan or when we're someplace else where there aren't the cultural differences? How do you see women integrating into special forces beyond that?
First, I'll say that one of my regrets is that we didn't start doing this, my first year in command or sooner rather than my last year in command, because, as you said, I wasn't there to see the implementation of it. But I did monitor it. I have a vested interest in it, tried to pay attention to it, and I'm fiercely proud of what the CSTs were able to do. I think that ultimately commanders will make the right decision about how to employ women under their command, given the right information to do that. But the CST program now doesn't exist. It came to a close last year. The changing circumstances in Afghanistan, the withdrawal back to main bases, the turnover of the lead for operations to the Afghan forces. And by the way, I learned today that some of the CSTs trained female Afghan counterparts to become Afghan CSTs, which those have got to be some amazingly courageous women. But I'm in favor of and I don't know where it's going to go, but if you're asking me where I think it should go, I'm in favor of establishing a program like the CST in an enduring manner, so that we don't have to sort of go through this process again of finding out who's interested, how to do it. I do think that we lack the incentives, we lack the structure, we lack the promotion system to recognize the enormously valuable service that the women provided, and I'd like to see some sort of a change to that. But I do believe that sustaining them as sort of combat enablers, I don't like that term, but you know what I mean, is something that we ought to do.
And let's get to the sticky question that we're in the middle of now, which is standards. And I think generally people hear that, and they hear that they're going to integrate women even further, and that 2016 is the year that they either have to integrate women to services completely into combat or explain why they didn't. So how do you explain the standards? And I'm going to start with you guys, because the perception is that for women to get in there, you lower standards, and yet they're just taking another look at standards.
Tiffany and I both feel very strongly about standards, so we'll be happy to talk about this. But I think at least my own personal perspective is that you cannot change the standards, you cannot lower the standards. And I think that that's frustrating to some people, because they want to see quotas met, they want to see a percentage of women in these roles, and I think, unfortunately, I think that's personally the wrong way of going about it. I think the thing that makes Special Operations Command so special and capable of doing the mission that it does is because it has the highest standards. They are the best of the best. And if you're going to have women serving in these roles, I think women are going to have to meet the same standards. And that might mean only 1% of women make it. That might be the reality. I'm not sure what it looks like, but I think lowering the standard or changing the standard would be very much the wrong move.
And just to caveat what Emily was saying, in my personal opinion, lower standards that exist for women currently, physically in the military, are lowering. It's degrading and it's kind of insulting. They're expected to do the same job as men in most cases, and moving forward with the integration in combat arms, we need to perform exactly the same as men. Otherwise, we will be considered a liability. If you tell a woman she only has to meet this level of standard and then ask a man to meet a higher standard, you're automatically creating an understandable level of doubt in that male's mind that, oh, well, she only has to meet this standard. She's not going to be able to keep up.
So I think the discussion about standards so far has only been talking about physical standards. And I think that it relates to putting women in front-line, close combat positions, which frankly I don't support. I think that the value of women, who constitute at the most 10 to 15% of our ranks, and mostly at the junior levels, I think that the greatest value of women is not how many push-ups they can do or how fast they can run, although they have to be able to keep up with the teams they're supporting. The physical standard has to be high. But I think it has much more to do with their intelligence, their perseverance, their courage, their mental agility, their ability to interact in a very human way in the places that we send them. And so I don't believe, frankly, in gender norming standards. I think that we can have a different set of standards for the women as long as it is a very high standard that enables the women to do everything they need to do on the battlefield in support of the combat operations. I think the women deserve far more. I think there ought to be women in far more places in the military than there are, but I'm personally not ready to see them take the first bullet on the target.
And why not?
I think that, I'm sorry, but men and women are different. They're physiologically different and they are psychologically different. They just are. There's a lot of scientific basis behind that. And I think that, that men in virtually every society and every species are reluctant to trust their lives to women in the same way they do to men. They're less likely to commit women to their death or to capture than they are to commit another man. And I think, as one foreign counterpart once said to me, he said, "How can I be defending the future of my homeland when the future of my homeland is dying beside me?" And so I think that there is a psychological standard that I don't think we can wish that away. I just don't think we can wish that away. I think there are other issues.
But has the country not gotten used to that in some ways?
I don't think so. I have talked to some very, very tough, strong men who have spent most of the last several years in hospitals and who tell me that the only time they cry is when an injured woman comes through for treatment. We're not ready. I don't think we're numb to that. And frankly, I hope we never become numb to that. I think there are a lot of other issues that are getting too much press. I think that I don't think it's about hygiene or privacy or sexual intimacy or fraternization or sexual harassment. I think we can overcome all of those issues given enough time and experience. But I do think that that when only a small percentage of your force is women and the value they bring is so special, like the explosive ordnance technicians who aren't in the front line, like the interpreters who aren't in the front line, like your biomedical data collection guy who's not in the front line, like your second-level medical guy who's not in the front line, that the best use of the amazing women who volunteer and are qualified to go forward and serve in the combat environment. I believe that remains the best role for them.
Captain Miller, Captain Amos, would you like to disagree with the Admiral?
No, I really respect Admiral Olson's opinion, and we had spoken previously. With equal opportunity comes equal obligation. So if you're going to put men into the infantry that don't necessarily want to be there, in the military you don't always have a choice. In my opinion, you also have to, put women who don't necessarily want to be in the infantry. That's a difficult problem to solve. I recognize and I respect that it's a very difficult road ahead. I think that there needs to be slow, deliberate steps taken to ensure that integration is done correctly. And I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered and solved as we move forward.
I absolutely agree. I think, you have to do it slowly, you have to do it thoughtfully. I guess I see it from the perspective of, one of my close friends is one of the 8 women in Ranger School right now, moving on to the next phase, and I think she's kind of the perfect example for me as a role model that if there's a standard and you can meet it, then why shouldn't the opportunity be there? Because I think that she has the physical capabilities and the mental capabilities to be with the best of the best, and I guess that's why I feel very strongly that standards shouldn't change, and that I think a lot of women actually could do it and could be very, very effective out there right next to the Navy SEALs and Rangers.
And just to add, in my personal opinion, I think the psychological effect of women dying on the battlefield is a very individual basis. It's not gender-based. I've definitely spoken with men who were severely affected by Ashley's death. And then I've spoken with other men that said, hey, I didn't know her. She was an enabler. It's terrible that she died. That's horrible. But my buddy who just died on that last mission, I've served with him for 8 years. His death affected me much, much more than hers did.
Yeah, I want to go and read this passage. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever said this on Capitol Hill before, but if I could add to that. Please don't misunderstand me. I think that Rangers School ought to be open to women. But not everybody who serves in a combat enabler role needs to be a Ranger School graduate. I think that if we that if we come to believe that, then we will end up with far fewer women as far forward as we need for them to be. We need a far greater number of women doing what the CSTs did than are likely to get through Ranger School. And that's why I think that we can establish a different standard for something like the CSTs, is because they don't all need to be Ranger School graduates to be powerful as CST members. That's not the main value they bring. I do think that wearing the Ranger tab is an important distinction in the Army, and women ought to be eligible to go to the school to earn the Ranger tab alongside men. I just don't think that, I would say that there are a lot of men, most men who earn the Ranger tab don't go to the 75th Ranger Regiment and serve in platoons on combat raids and assaults in Afghanistan. And I'm just saying that the women who go to Ranger School and earn the Ranger tab, and I think what, there's 6 now, 8 now, 8 out of 19. When they earn their Ranger tab, I wouldn't expect them to be assigned to a frontline Ranger assault unit because there's so much else that people with Ranger tabs can do. And by the way, the Rangers...
What about promotions? I mean, that's often the argument you hear,
Yeah.
that unless you can be in those frontline troops, you're not going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You're not going to be the Chief of Staff of the Army.
I mean, I don't get that argument completely, I have to say. I spoke yesterday with General Ann Dunwoody, the Army's first 4-star, and she's quite clear in her book.
Logistician, right?
Yeah, she's quite clear in her book, which was published about the same time as Gayle's, that she wanted to be airborne, she wanted to be a jump master, but she didn't want to go to Ranger School, and she didn't want to be an infantryman. And she got promoted to 4-star. So I do know that there's an advantage. If you perform well in a combat environment, that is advantageous to promotion. But I don't think, again, we should wish away, we should not too early convince ourselves that women on the front line of combat will outperform their male counterparts to the point where they are promoted ahead of the men. So you got to be careful what you wish for, and what I think would be hugely detrimental would be to find women in these frontline combat units who then didn't promote. And I think we need to find other opportunities to promote women through other, just other opportunities, other structures, other training, other sort of job assignments, other utilization. And I think that women certainly ought to have equal promotion opportunity to men, but I'm just not convinced that that they are going to promote so much better if you put them in the frontline combat units.
Okay, I want to go back to the CSTs. And Gayle, what you think should happen next, and what you see as this book opening up, as their experiences opening up, and also the women coming back and not having that anymore for time being.
Well, first, I think this is the first step, is actually having a conversation around, so much of the conversation around women in combat is about what women could do or should do or are capable of, and very little about it is an acknowledgement of what they've already done. And so for me, I think this is the first step, is having a conversation. You know, I talked to Rangers about losing Ashley, and later about losing Jenny Moreno, who was the second cultural support team member to die 2 years later. And I definitely saw a range of views. I think it's all, as you know, as Captain Amos and Captain Miller say, it's all a process. You know, I don't think you flip a switch and have a cultural shift, but I think that the more you have role models come forward, you know, these women may have been selected because they were female, but they performed in the battle space because they're soldiers. And because every single one of them would tell you there is no mission that they've ever done before or will ever do after that mattered more to them than this one, because they got to serve with people who were the best at what they did night after night, who gave them a shot not just to be good, but to be the best that they could be. And I think that is what is so compelling. What made me keep going and writing this story is that it was a soldier story we hadn't yet seen about a group of people who asked only to serve their country in the most relevant, most powerful, and most central way to the mission possible. So I worked very hard to keep my own personal views out of this book. This book is not about politics, it's about purpose. And I do hope that people, when they see people who are motivated by that purpose, will have a conversation about what it is that these soldiers do and are capable of and why they matter to the mission.
Basically, just tell us a little bit about when you came back and the care you've been given and what changes, if any, you think need to be made.
I'll take that one first, Martha. When I came back, coming home is always very difficult. I don't care if you're an infantryman, an intel analyst, I don't care what role you're over there as a civilian. Coming home's difficult. It's very difficult to reassimilate back into civilian culture. Many people choose to come off active duty. I myself came off active duty so I could focus on my family and apply to medical school. The best decision that I made was joining the Army Reserves. It allowed me to keep that little piece of military in my life that I love so much and really ease the transition for me. I was fortunate enough not to have any need for VA services, so I can't speak to that. But I would ask that Congress remember and remain resolute and diligent in the care of the wounded soldiers and also the families of the fallen.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to, go ahead,
No,
please,
go
Emily.
ahead. Go ahead.
I want to open it up for questions if there are any.
Could I say one more thing?
Please.
And I think Emily just made a great point. I think that this is about I think it's less about what women can and can't do and more about what women should and shouldn't do. But I think the point that's important is that equal opportunity equals equal obligation, equal commitment, equal expectation. Not all men volunteer for the infantry. Most don't. But many men are assigned to the infantry against their will. And one of the things we're talking about in this conversation, or should be, is whether or not we're willing to assign women to the infantry against their will. It can't just be about opportunity. We always talk about a fierce firefight where there is blood and gore and dust and chaos as an opportunity. Not everybody considers it that. Yeah, so I talked a little bit about watching women die, but it's really less about that. It's really more about the tactical decision-making of male leaders in a combat environment, being less willing to commit a woman to her death or to captivity. And so I think that's the more important bridge to cross, because once you've started affecting the decision-making dynamic on the battlefield, you've caused the capability of that unit to deteriorate. And so I think, yes, some women have died in combat, and although we're not numb to it, we do accept it as a fact of life in today's military. But I do think, as I said, the more difficult bridge is causing men to willfully commit women to a higher risk of death or capture.
Anybody want to take that one? Well, you certainly, that's part of the reason you were there, is to talk to the women, to gather intel.
I'd say that's a great question, sir. Bullets kill either way, so man, woman, indifferent. Bullet's still going to do its job, but I think it absolutely has an effect on the enemy. I can only speak to my personal experience, but we had to work a lot with the Afghan army, our Afghan counterparts, and it was difficult assimilating with them. They had to get over the culture shocks. They kind of saw us as a third gender. We weren't really women in their mind, but we weren't men. It was very interesting. Some relationships, it's all about interpersonal relationships. Some relationships with the ANA, with the Afghan army, were very good. Some were not. So, in my opinion, it's personal relationships.
I think that third gender is very real. I think, Martha can talk about it better than probably anybody in this room, but when you report or when you are in hot environments, there is a definite sort of cloak you wear because you are not local female. So local men, Afghan men, would definitely talk to you in a way that they would not necessarily talk to an American man. And also women will talk to you. So you get to be part of this third gender. I remember the first time I was in Afghanistan, we didn't know where to sit because my colleague, who is a journalist and a great tremendous person also, so I don't know if we have to sit in the female section because I'm with you and you're a foreigner. So we sat, because of security, this was early on in Afghanistan, we sat in the male sections, and later when security deteriorated further, just because we both wanted to be back from the front of the restaurants, we would sit toward the back in the family section. But I do think that you have an ability to move among worlds in a lot of those environments that we don't know about a lot here at home that is very apparent there on the ground.
Just one quick thing. When you would go to these homes, for instance, you would take your helmets off, correct? So they could see that you were a woman because you're all kitted up and do all that, and that was important.
Yeah, for sure. At one point, I actually had long hair. Would take my helmet off, let our hair down. We'd have our headsets on, but so we could still hear the radio. But yeah, that was critical to gaining their trust. And with all of our gear and everything that we had on, it wasn't immediately obvious, that we were women. And so that really helped, I think, disarming them and getting them to at least just talk to us and calm down. And because it's very chaotic when you're on a target and you're coming into someone's home at night. And so I think that did really, really help a lot. And the third gender thing is very real as well. I know my own experience with the Afghan National Army was actually very positive. They treated me, they didn't know, they didn't treat me, they don't know what to do with us, but they're as professional as you could hope they would be, and they would invite me to meals where their team would meet. So I had positive interactions, but I think that is because we don't fit into any nice box.
And it is a curiosity, and it remains a curiosity. I was in Iraq last month, and I had the selfie generation, so we must have done 500 pictures with Iraqi forces. I finally had to move me out of the area. I just like some final thoughts. I really do think it's a great conversation about what you've all done, and we're also proud of you. And we're especially proud of you, Gayle, for bringing this to light in this really important book, not only for Americans to understand what still goes on, and I always like to remind people that we still have troops out there in the fight, in Afghanistan, more and more in Iraq, and while supposedly they're not in combat, they are always in danger, and I think we should think of them and the amazing women I have met over the years. I'm glad to meet two more who have brought so much to the military, and as Admiral Olson points out, they bring, I guess we should say, they bring gifts that others can't in many ways, that they bring something to the fight that wasn't there before, and that has truly enhanced our military. Admiral Olson, I would love you just a few final thoughts, and Gayle a few final thoughts, and then we'll close it for the day.
I think the statement that that the women, once they were on the target, needed to obviously be women, is a very important one, because that was the reason that we created the whole cultural support team, was to have women be women forward and be able to learn those things that no man could learn, talk to it, and we keep talking half the population. It's really much more than half of the population, because it includes young boys too, who generally wouldn't talk to the male soldiers, but they would talk to the female soldiers. And they would find things, particularly where no man would ever find them. They could enter spaces that no man could enter. It was enormously valuable. They were essential. And I said that I wasn't there for the implementation of the program that we began, but I did ask and listen carefully to what was being said about them, and the level of respect for the CSTs was enormous. I won't say it wasn't without issue, it wasn't without drama, but it was enormous level of respect and appreciation for what the women brought as women, uniquely in that, for the purpose that we created them. I guess I shouldn't repeat myself, but I would like to see, first of all, I don't represent anybody here but myself. I want to be clear about that. I've sort of been briefed, and I understand where the Special Operations Command is going. I think they're apace with all the expectations and requirements to do the studies, to make the recommendations regarding the role of women in combat, but I don't represent them here today. But I would like to see that sort of a program structured and sustained. I think that there is a very important role, obviously, for women, and I think that they ought to be incentivized to do that. They ought to be promoted for doing it. They ought to be organized to do it. One of the reasons you asked, or sort of early on, we talked about whether or not there was resistance to the establishment of the program. There was not, because I didn't have to really deal with anybody to establish the program. But in order to permanentize the program, I did have to deal with other people, and that's where the obstacles were. We couldn't get an MOS created, a military occupational specialty, for the CSTs. So we had to decide if we were going to take these amazing women who had done all this in the cultural support teams and then find a home for them in the civil affairs battalions or in the military information support operations battalions, which was pretending that they were doing something other than what we had created them to do. So I'd like to see that really structured in a way that that transitions commanders, transitions budgets, transitions sort of the fight of the day or the crisis of the day, because and I do think that, you know, I'm all about optimizing the capability of the force. I had no other purpose, and I do think that that's an important step towards doing that.
I think we have a real privilege to be witnessing evolution and shifting of the United States military before our eyes in this moment. And it has been an enormous privilege for me to be able to capture just one story that I think sheds light on so many of the conversations that are going on. You know, General McChrystal in his interview said, we would never have done this 10 years earlier, even if we thought we needed it, because there were so many hurdles we would have had to get over in our own minds as leadership. And I think, you know, we don't know where this conversation will be in 10 more years. And I think that's what is so fascinating about where we are, and to see so many Americans who truly are patriots and simply want to answer the call to serve that their nation puts out. The final thought I'd leave you is this Ranger First Sergeant, a retired Ranger First Sergeant I talked to last week, was talking about being nimble as a force, and that the Ranger Regiment was created as an adaptive and a very nimble force, and that the CSTs were just one more way in which they needed to adapt. And what he said was, a job well done stands out. And it didn't matter to me who was doing that job, as long as it was well done. And so, you know, he was incredibly supportive of having this capability on his team and wanted more of it. And I do hope that as people go forward and read this story, and I hope so many more that follow, it's just one slice of a history that I think we need to know and tells us not just about our past, but about our future for us. So thank you.
If I could just clarify something that Gayle just said, and that's really the purpose of the modern Rangers in their modern day evolution. The Rangers were created to be a small, agile, light infantry force, but the reason that far more Rangers go through Ranger School than will ever go into that 75th Ranger Regiment is so that that rising tide will lift all boats, so that Rangers, people with Ranger tabs, having been through Ranger School, which is a great leadership school and a leadership school that women ought to have the opportunity to attend, is so that then the women graduates of the Ranger School will also be able to lift all boats. So it's not just about going through Ranger School to be in a Ranger platoon. Ranger School has a much bigger purpose than that.
Thank you, Admiral Olson. I'll see you again in 3 or 4 years then on a panel. It'll take that long. And thank you so much, Captain Miller, Captain Amos, and thank you, Gayle, and we will all remember Ashley.